We've got a new segment, as I mentioned. It's a very important one in this election year in 2010. We're going to pit two of the best performers from federal politics against one another in that process, hoping to deliver a little more than the everyday political spin. Of course, that depends on the willingness of our two guests to play ball. Chris Bowen is the Minister for Financial and Human Services, a member of the Cabinet and an acute political observer. Next to him in our Parliament House studio is high-profile Liberal frontbencher Christopher Pyne, also the Shadow Education Minister. Good morning, gentlemen, both named Chris.
Good morning, Fran.
Morning, Fran. Good to be with you.
Chris Bowen, it's an election year. And the first polls, talking particularly about the news poll yesterday, shows that the gap is closing pretty quickly. Why don't we get this off our chests right up front? Can I ask both of you, who's the underdog here? Chris Bowen?
Well, every election is tough. We don't take it for granted. And the Prime Minister made that clear to the caucus earlier in the week. And he's made it clear to the Cabinet on an ongoing basis that we fight every election as if it's going to come down to the wire, and this election was always going to get tight. You've got the opposition out there saying we can fix all the problems with no cost. That's always going to have some short-term political bounce.
Do you believe that, though? I mean, how fragile do you think your lead is?
Well, without going into the fragility of our lead,
Go on.
Having been through a few elections and at various levels, I know that things can turn around very quickly, and that people are very punishing of a government that thinks it's got everything home and hosed, and we certainly don't take that view. And I know, to pay him due respect, John Howard never had that view when they were in office, and it's not a view that we take.
Speaking of John Howard, he famously declared once after the Aston by-election that the government was back in the game. Christopher Pyne, what do you reckon? Is the coalition back in the game?
Well, I hate to describe him this way, Fran, but I think Chris Bowen's being too cute by half about
I'll accept you calling
about
me cute,
the
Chris,
fragility of the government's lead. The coalition needed 11 seats to win this coming election before the redistributions across Australia. We now need 17 seats to win the election. That is a very tall mountain to climb. The odds would have to be on the government. There's been one-term government since the 20s. That was the Scullin government, which was defeated at the beginning of the Depression. Other than that, governments always get a second term and sometimes even a third and fourth term. So the prospects of the opposition winning are limited. I think it can be done, but there's no doubt at all that we are the underdogs, and I think if you visit the sports bets or centre bet sites on the web, you'll see where the odds lie. They don't lie with the opposition. That said, we will put in a tremendous effort because we believe that this government needs to be turned out. We think that it is damaging Australia, and with its great big new tax and rising interest rates and rising cost of living expenses, the pressure on families and people on fixed incomes in particular are too great.
Okay,
but
so
we'll try not to have too much political rhetoric and try and be more factual for your show. Although Mr. Bowen started with a bit of rhetoric.
That would be most unlike you, Chris.
It's going to be tough, no doubt about it. But has the coalition got its mojo back? Is the mood completely different now than it was under Malcolm Turnbull?
Well, Fran, this is an election year, and the first 2 years after our defeat in 2007, it's fair to say that the opposition has been licking its wounds, and not a very attractive word picture, but licking its wounds and trying to recover from its defeat after 11 and a half years in government. But this is an election year. The coalition is now entirely united. We have a policy on climate change action, which is direct action, which will cost about $10 billion over 10 years. I'm quite happy to pit that against the government's $114 billion new tax over 10 years, and I think the Australian public have a clear choice. In terms of the leaders, we have Kevin Rudd, who made a lot of commitments before 2007. Most of those commitments have not been kept, most spectacularly on hospitals, where he promised a referendum if hospitals weren't fixed. And now I notice he's promising a referendum again after the 2010 election if hospitals aren't fixed. And I think the Australian public are wising up to a government that's made a lot of promises, is involved in a lot of talk, but not a lot of action. On our side, we have Tony Abbott, who I think is seen as a man of action. He certainly is a person who says what he means and means what he says, and sometimes with the Prime Minister it's quite hard to work out exactly what he has just said, and I think that will be a great contrast for the Australian public to make their choice this year.
Okay, and just on that, we will come back to the climate change policy. It's important that we do, but speaking of language, Chris Bowen, we have a pledge now by the Prime Minister for some clear speaking. Let's hear from your boss yesterday.
I think our challenge is to communicate more effectively that which we have done. To communicate our record of achievement more effectively than we have done. And I think we all share some responsibility for that, including myself.
Chris Bowen, did you heave a sigh of relief when the PM uttered those words yesterday?
Well, Fran, I think it's a challenge for politicians, not only in Australia, around the world, particularly in this climate change debate, which I know you said we'd come back to. But this is, frankly, a contest between complex truths and simple lies. And the easiest political job will be those who are peddling the simple lies. The more difficult job will be those of us who have to communicate the complex truths, and that does have its challenges. But you know, when you settle on a sound grab, great big tax, which Chris now likes, it's not a sound grab I think he used when he was arguing to support the ETS in the party room 2 months ago. But now that he's running that sound grab and he's taken the lead from his leader, that is a very simple line. I accept that. It's a line that's very easy to get cut through. Making the case for climate change action, making the case for an ETS is a more difficult task. Of course it is, but it's a task that we are raring to go, and we are looking forward to the election campaign, bearing in mind that we have the job of communicating those complex issues.
Would you accept that Tony Abbott is a pretty powerful and direct communicator, and that might be tough for Kevin Rudd to match?
Well, so is Mark Latham, Fran. And it comes down to matters of substance. It comes down to a complex policy debate, and a simple and an easy grab, which you're quite right, Mr. Abbott does reasonably well, can get you through for a little while. But when push comes to shove, the Australian people are much more nuanced, have a much more sophisticated view of their voting patterns and their decisions, and they will not be persuaded by simple sound grabs.
Christopher?
Well, before the last election, Fran, the simple lie was that Kevin Rudd would fix everything. Kevin Rudd said he'd fix hospitals. Kevin Rudd said he'd fix Indigenous disadvantage. Kevin Rudd said he'd fix the Japanese whaling in our oceans. Kevin Rudd said he'd be a fiscal conservative. Kevin Rudd said whatever was needed to win the last election. And he won the election. And of course now Chris Bowen is trying to make it out that the government realises that some of these issues are more complex. But before the 2007 election, Kevin Rudd said, "We'll just fix it. Elect us and we'll fix it. The buck stops with me." Now, of course, in government, he's backpedalling away from that. Iran hasn't been taken to the International Court of Justice. The Japanese haven't been prosecuted in an international court as he promised. Indigenous disadvantage is getting worse. Money is being wasted in remote communities that hasn't been spent on housing. He's hardly been a fiscal conservative. We have enormous debt. We have an enormous deficit, which we didn't have under the Howard government. The list is endless. He was going to protect our borders. In fact, I think he even said he was going to turn the boats back. But instead, we've had over 3,000 arrivals since he watered down the border protection laws in August 2008. And of course, Chris Bowen refers to...
I'm glad you've dropped the rhetoric, Chris. That's really
Chris
good.
Bowen, well... You weren't engaging in any rhetoric at all, were you? Even to the point of attacking former Labor leaders, I noticed. See, Labor will do anything, Fran, to try and win an election, and now they're prepared to turn on their former leaders in order to try and look like they've changed. But sadly, leopards don't change their spots. Labor is a big taxing and big spending government, and of course their great big new tax on everything is the penultimate example of how Labor wants to introduce a new tax to solve a problem rather than doing what the coalition wants to do, which of course is introduce incentives. A mechanism we use all the time in government, like incentives for superannuation or incentives for solar panels. We're going to use incentives to reduce pollution.